Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And as the name of my channel would suggest, the Booker Prize is a fairly big part of it, partly because I started the channel as a way of keeping myself accountable while doing the challenge to read all of the shortlisted books from over the years. And as the channel has sort of gone on, in the last 3-ish years almost, I've clearly just been distracted so much that I've not actually finished that project, but should do soon. And anyway, part of that distraction has also been that for the last few years, I have made it a kind of a personal point to read another book by shortlisted authors from each year's Booker. And I do that for sort of several reasons, but the main reason being, so often when I'm reading the shortlist of the Booker, I will read an author who's relatively new to me or who I've heard about for a while but haven't maybe read as much of, and often really fall in love with their work. And what that sometimes means is I then sort of do that classic thing of saying to myself, oh, well, I'll just have to read something of theirs sometime. And I think a couple of years ago, I was like, right, we're going to make this a mini challenge that I will do because I needed more reading pressure. And part of that will be to read an additional book, which is just, one other book by the authors who are shortlisted. Some years, obviously, not all of them have other books. And you will see with this one, there is an author who has other books, but just in another language. But it's kind of a fun little challenge for me to see what else they've written and kind of have get a bit of a sense of what that shortlist would be like if it was another work of theirs that was submitted. And so with that in mind, I'm going to revisit these authors for the list and do so with another book that I've read of theirs. So let's get going reading them. It's worth noting, by the way, at the jump here, two things, which is firstly, I've sort of picked them relatively at random. I had some really great suggestions from people, so thank you for people who suggested other works by these authors. And the other kind of thing that's worth noting right from the jump is Yael van der Wouden, one of the shortlisted authors this year for the Safekeep, has got other books. And as far as I'm aware, I can only find her other books in Dutch, which I currently don't read. And rather than try to sort of do some very quick maxed out Duolingo to try and get myself through a Dutch novel, I might just wait until that book is translated. And I'm guessing the shortlisting of her book, The Safekeep, will probably mean that her other previous novels are translated as well into English, which would be fab. But that means we're kind of one down, so I'm going to start with 5 books instead. And so the first of those, going again alphabetically like I did with the last ones, is Percival Everett, shortlisted this year for James, and I've read a couple of his other books, which I really enjoyed. I was tempted to almost not read another one and just use Erasure by him, which I love. I think it's an incredible novel by Percival Everett. I think it's better than The Trees, which is what he was shortlisted for previously. And the thing is, I already used that before in another video. I've also read Dr. No, which I enjoyed, but I think maybe there are better. So I tried I Am Not Sidney Poitier. And this was a fun read in several ways, and in many ways makes sense alongside his other books. It's very, very much what we've come to expect, I think, from Percival Everett. It is, on one hand, a sort of searing critique of several things, particularly in this case around celebrity and around racial identity and kind of the ways that those are, the way that racial identity is perceived, particularly in the US. But it is also a really farcical novel with a kind of joke at its center. And that joke in this book is that as we're told right from the very beginning, this man has his name, and his name is not Sidney Poitier, as in not Sidney is his first name. And obviously this leads to all of these moments during the book where someone says, "What's your name?" And he says, "Not Sidney Poitier." And people say to him, "Okay, so you're not Sidney Poitier, so what's your name?" That kind of classic joke. I will say that joke becomes a little bit tired as you go through the book, particularly towards the end, where you're like, okay, he does do a few things to keep it fresh, such as kind of alternative versions of it, or moments where a character gets it and the joke is that they got it first time, or even just other times where he meets these other figures. But the core idea of it is this young man, not Sidney Poitier, goes through life and is constantly confused for that reason. He looks a lot like Sidney Poitier, and part of the joke is also that maybe his mother slept with Sidney Poitier. He becomes sort of semi-famous in his own right because of looking so much like Sidney Poitier. He's generally awful to a lot of women in his life. And I don't know why I'm laughing. I mean, but that part of the joke is almost how awful this character is, in part. But he gets caught up in this really farcical, absurd kind of moment at the end of the book, which is like partly a case of mistaken identity about Sidney Poitier, but also like bananas, just like utterly bananas of just like potentially a murder plot, but like, you know, it's a wild book. I think it is very much indicative of his sort of style of writing, which is this completely like ultra farcical, ultra satirical take on things, but really through that lens exploring some really important topics, and often uncomfortable topics, but turning up the discomfort and the humor to the max, just so you've got this very odd world that you have to live in during it. Yeah, a wild book, but one that I enjoyed overall. Next up, we have Samantha Harvey with her novel, well, shortlisted this year for the novel Orbital, which is this very tight but also very floaty book about people in space. And it's so interesting comparing this to the other book that I read from her, Dear Thief. And this is a very different book in many ways, but has the sort of specificity of her observation that I really enjoyed. So Dear Thief is a long letter. It is written as a letter. And so even though you might not necessarily always believe it as a letter, it's always the difficult thing with a novel that's written as a letter. You know, nobody would actually write a 200-page letter, or you'd hope not. It actually, I think, really works because of just this like forcefulness of tone that's kept throughout. And essentially, the story is a woman who is writing to this thief, who is a former close friend of hers, and basically they've had a massive fallout, and we don't know what that is for most of the story, or for a fair bit of the story. And what we then later find out is exactly what has happened. And the story is that this sort of love triangle that came up has led to a breakdown in their friendship. And so we start to kind of get a sense of why she might be called a thief. And at the beginning of this novel, it's really difficult to see exactly what that is, because there are all of these other competing details. We have her talking about her parents, and her talking about India and various other things. And these slowly come to kind of converge into one place about what's really happened here. And it kind of allows this tone to do some really interesting things, because what starts as a very bitter tone of, well, I can't believe you didn't know this, and I'm writing to you furious on this day about this thing, slowly softens as parts of her memory return about the family and also about their relationship, you know, her relationship with her friend. Because she can talk about saying, oh, well, you know, I know that you were always the kind of person who would observe these things, or I remember fondly when we had that trip and this thing happened. And her tone will briefly soften and then harden back again when she realizes that she needs to convince herself and this other person that she has been the wronged person. And so it's so fascinating. I really love what she's done here. I think this is such a brilliant piece of observation, and a real piece of genius, I think, for maintaining a tone throughout this whole book, which I don't know how she does it, because it's incredibly difficult, I think, to kind of maintain what feels like a letter for 250 pages or whatever it is. Yeah, really interesting book. Next up, Rachel Kusher, who was shortlisted this year for Creation Lake. And the book I'm going to talk about is a former shortlisting of hers, which was The Mars Room, shortlisted in 2018. And this was a book that I enjoyed, even if I think, I don't know, maybe I'm just not, maybe Rachel Kusher and I are not meant to be. But I mean, I overall enjoyed The Mars Room, and I think probably more maybe than Creation Lake. But essentially, we start quite quickly with Rachel Kusher's main character being in this sort of prison facility thing. And very quickly we sort of see almost the kind of, it reminded me a bit of Handmaid's Tale in this respect, of what it looks like when a group of people are kind of trapped in an unfair system. In this case, this sort of prison system, and particularly when there's a gendered element of this. So all of these women in this facility, and what kind of happens is that they all find various ways to wield power and to stay safe. The reason I say it reminds me of Handmaid's Tale is that those sort of scenes you get of not only the sort of the sisters, or the kind of I've now completely forgotten all words, but the kind of the sort of matriarch figures in Handmaid's Tale, and how they're constantly trying to battle for power, but also how you get these sort of other scenes, such as the women who live outside of society in the kind of undercover strip club or kind of speakeasy in Handmaid's Tale. And in many ways, the Mars room has sort of some of those little qualities of these odd rooms where you have women having to wield whatever they've got to kind of have power. So these sort of the social dynamics, wielding sexuality and sex, all these other things. And what you kind of get through this book then is this sort of real dissection of power and how it is used. I will say I think Handmaid's Tale did that better, but I still think this is a really interesting book. I think the way that, particularly the introduction of a male character who's observing this and is trying to teach women in this prison facility is interesting, because he sort of throws in a different dynamic of how his gender both frees him from some of this, but also means that he often doesn't see some of what's happening as well. So yeah, it's an interesting book, and I think it's clear from the few books. Well, I've only read 2 of hers now, but bits I've heard about some of her other books, including the Flamethrowers, I think it is, or the Fire Throwers, is a lot about this kind of dissection of power and how it is used, the kind of corrupting influence of power and politics and all these other things within the book. Next up, Anne Michaels, who in the Booker shortlist this year is shortlisted for Held, and the book I have read of hers is Fugitive Pieces, which won the Women's Prize. And actually, this is one of the cases where I'm really glad that I've done this project for this specific reason, which is reading Fugitive Pieces has given me a new appreciation for Held, because Anne Michaels, from these 2 books, this is a lot to judge a whole author by. Her style is this really deeply lyrical, floaty, meandering thing. And I don't mean to talk that down. I think it's really well achieved. And so my main issue when I first read Held was that I really enjoyed what was happening, but I couldn't really remember it afterwards. And Fugitive Pieces gave me a new appreciation for it, because I kind of came to realize what she's doing here, that the kind of experience of this book is so much more than just the kind of, it's not always necessarily about plot anyway, but the kind of floatiness of this book is the purpose. This is what it's doing. The kind of meandering allows her to take these leaps of thought and go to these other places and do things that would not be possible within a more sort of straightforward narrative. And so, whereas in Held, these sort of longer sort of thought pieces kind of turn into sort of a discussion about life and death and various other things, in Fugitive Pieces, it allows her to explore Jewish diaspora alongside an identity and sense of belonging with place. And so, we've got a woman who is in Greece, and she is thinking about Jewish diaspora and Jewish history, and particularly then that alongside Greek hospitality and sense of family and specific words and wordplay that is used to talk about family and identity and belonging, and how all of these kind of concepts and thoughts meander and are sticky and are a bit strange, that actually, a country like Greece can speak about hospitality, but then also there were moments of Jews being expelled from various countries across Europe. And so we see these kind of parallels happening between a country talking about its ideals and who it is, and the kind of reality once other things, particularly around politics, get involved. And so Fugitive Pieces, although at times I sort of did lose where we were going with it, gave me a newfound appreciation for Held, and particularly makes me want to think that I need to reread Held, because of how that kind of floatiness is the strength. It allows her to take these, almost develop a thesis throughout the book. And there are times where, in Fugitive pieces, I was completely unsure of where she was going, of just, okay, here's a thought, and then we're going over here, and now we're talking about Greece, and we're talking about this term for family, and we're doing this. And then, oh, wait, here's the point. And yeah, I think this is a really interesting piece of writing. And so, skipping Yael van der Voorden for the reasons I gave earlier, we have Charlotte Wood, shortlisted here for Stoneyard Devotional, and going back and reading her other books, well, another book of hers was really interesting. I had read a book of hers years ago called The Weekend. I realised I couldn't remember enough about it and kind of wanted to read something new by her anyway. So I read The Natural Way of Things, which is brutal and kind of is really challenging, but in a good way. Essentially, what happens at the beginning of this book is that we are told that we basically hear the stories of young women who wake up unsure of how they've got there, and basically are in the middle of the kind of the bush in Australia. They are kind of far away from everything. They don't know exactly what's happened. They don't know how they got there. They're a little woozy from whatever they've been drugged with to sort of kidnap them. But as they come to talk, and as they come up against some of the staff around them, they realise what's happened here. They are all women who have been involved in some way with a news story or a big moment about particularly sexual assault, or kind of something linked to that. And the kind of reason that they've all been brought together seems to be for punishment, that essentially these women are being treated as if this is righting the wrongs of them having called out sexual assault. This is what I mean by it's a brutal and very difficult book to read at times. So, for example, one woman sort of has reported sexual assault. There were some bits of justice, not much, but some bits of justice against the perpetrator, and this is now seen as her penance for having caused this man some harm. And it's really difficult because it's presented to them as if this is for the best, that this is a way for them to lay low while all of the scandal around it disappears. But at the same time, these women are subjected to some of the most horrible things while they're there. They're basically treated like kind of convicts. They are paraded around various places. They are refused medical help. They are given very little food. It's a really horrible thing. But I think through doing this book makes a really poignant observation about the ways that justice is often meted out when it comes to sexual assault, to various other things. The fact that often, even if the person doing it, the perpetrator of that assault, faces some repercussions, so whether that's arrest, whether that's their name being dragged through the mud, whether it's going to prison, whatever, there is still a way that the public outcry is that the women deserved it, which is a horrible thing. That even though the women have come out the other end of this, they are still scarred by the experience. They are still their names are still attached to it, often publicly. So a newspaper article about it will follow them till the day they die, because their names, if they've not been kept anonymous, are linked forever to this assault. And so the way this book does this, I think, makes a really clever provides some really clever commentary on the ways that justice in these scenarios is uneven, that even the damage has still been done, and the damage still often continues long after the assault. It's a difficult book, but I think she handles it really well. There's a not lightness of touch, that's not the right phrase, but there's a way she crafts this book that allows some breathing whilst acknowledging some of the really difficult parts of this. And it's so interesting putting this against Stoneyard Devotional, which is so quiet and spare and lives in the moment of regret and kind of dredging up old memories and thinking about them. But here, I think there's an overlap perhaps in some parts of the themes, but this is a much scarier book in terms of the kind of loudness and action of what's going on here. And it's a really uncomfortable read, but a really essential one, I think, as well. So those are other books I've read by the authors. It's really interesting for me to do this, to read other books by those authors. Also to see kind of how much of an outlier sometimes the books that are shortlisted are from other pieces of their work. So for people like Percival, Everett, this is, James is in some ways a bit of a different book, but there's definitely a trademark Everett-ism to it. With someone like Charlotte Wood, the difference between Stoneyard Devotional and The Natural Way of Things feels so different because of the kind of tonal shift between the two books. But I think also just goes to show how supple and sort of versatile some of these authors are, that they're able to write books that feel so different and yet still work very much within their style. If I were to choose a winner of these books, and obviously this is a very differently curated list. This is just books I thought sounded interesting by the same authors or that I could get hold of. I really enjoyed all the books I read here. I'd probably say The Natural Way of Things by Charlotte Wood, or maybe Fugitive Pieces would be kind of up there as books that I think are particularly interesting. Samantha Harvey's Dear Thief, I think, is fascinating as well. So yeah, interesting set of books. And we'll soon know who the winner is, rather. I say winners, maybe there'll be multiple, but who the winner is of the Booker Prize this year. But either way, I urge you, if you like the authors that you've read as part of the Booker longlist or shortlist, to really check out other books by them, because often there are so many gems in there. I read another book by Hisham Attar as part of this, thinking he was going to get shortlisted, and that was The Return, which I really greatly enjoyed. So yeah, I'd highly recommend it. And also, if you know other really good books by these authors, please do suggest and share them. I'd love to hear them, and I'd love to be able to read more by these authors. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.